Hey, how's it going? Before we jump into the content, I just want to take a minute to thank you for stopping by the channel and checking out the content. If you like this content and you want to support more content like it, then make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. You can also check out the YouTube membership program and cybertrainingpro.com, where I put practice exams and other things that I couldn't put on YouTube. Again, regardless of how you support the channel and my content, I couldn't be more appreciative. Thank you so much, and let's get into the content. In our organizations, we can't simply tell people that they should do certain things or have certain behaviors. We need policies. Security policies are considered administrative controls, and they're documents that lay out our strategy when it comes to security. Policies are high-level documents, so they don't need to get into small details like a procedure document does, and they explain things like what's acceptable and our principles for security. After policies are created, plans and step-by-step procedures are put into place to meet those policies. The first type of policies that we're going to talk about are personnel policies. Now, personnel policies include expectations like employee behavior and the possible consequences for somebody who disregards or violates our policies. Think about when you first start a job and you get briefed on the rules. These are the personnel policies. Let's talk about some of the most popular personnel policies that exist. The Acceptable Use Policy, or the AUP, describes the purpose of computer systems and networks, how they can be used by users, and user responsibilities when using them. One of the things that people don't always realize is that companies don't typically want you to conduct much, if any, of your personal business on work computers. The AUP usually works together with a privacy policy because we monitor network activity, which means that we can potentially see things like logon credentials or other things that users are doing. The AUP is one of those policies that employees are required to agree with when they first get hired and before they get access to systems or networks. Mandatory vacation policies force employees to take a vacation from work. While that employee is gone, their work is evaluated to look for malicious activity like embezzlement or fraud. We can uncover other things too while that malicious employee is out on vacation and they can't continue to cover up their tracks. This is pretty common in financial institutions because when money's involved, there's a higher chance of malicious behavior. Separation of duties prevents a single person from being able to complete critical or sensitive processes on their own. It's a lot harder to get multiple people working together to be malicious, and this just reinforces that. For example, we don't want to have the same person configuring security and then performing an audit on the configurations because they could just overlook their malicious activity. This doesn't just apply to IT or cybersecurity staff. Least privilege means that people are only given the privileges to complete their job and nothing more. The main objective is to reduce risk. For example, the sales director doesn't need remote access to get into a server, just like the IT administrator doesn't need access to individual payroll entries. An important note with least privilege is that it's an ongoing review process. Periodically, and as employees change jobs, privileges have to be reviewed so that they don't continue to accumulate more access outside their current job scope. We call this privilege creep or permission creep. Job rotation is when we rotate people to different jobs so that they can learn the process and procedures in each job. Job rotation is good for a few reasons. First, we want to cross-train our employees so that we have backups. Second, going back to our separation of duty policy, it gives us fresh-eyed employees that will ask questions and help us identify where there might be issues. You have to also be cautious that you aren't switching employees that are working together, but overall job rotation is very beneficial. Clean desk space policies direct users to keep their work areas organized and free of papers. Imagine for a second if your desk was covered with sensitive documents and then you got a few deliveries and now you leave work for the day. You couldn't easily see sensitive documents and you left thinking that all was fine. Then the custodian crew comes in and they take the sensitive documents home with them. This is a real issue and it's completely possible if we don't force our employees to keep their work areas organized. If you've ever started a new job, then you know that basically every company is going to want to run a background check on you. Background checks most commonly check an employee's history to make sure that there isn't something to disqualify them from their new job. This means criminal history, financial history, and even potentially an employee's social media activity. The more sensitive the job role, the more detailed the background check. For example, if you were to go work for a defense contractor in the United States for a job dealing with classified information, you would have a much more thorough background check than if you went to work as a shelf stocker at Walmart. Onboarding is a process of granting individuals access to company systems and networks when they first get hired. For example, you'll get your network login information and possibly login credentials for certain applications. Offboarding is when an employee is actually leaving the company and their access needs to be terminated. This also includes collecting company property like cell phones, laptops, and badges. Offboarding sometimes happens when an employee is completing an exit interview. This is a sensitive time because ultimately, we don't want the person to have access anymore. Imagine if it took us a week to disable an employee's access after they left, but they could still access the network. The offboarding process typically varies depending on if the termination is mutual or if somebody's being fired or laid off. Non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs, are used to protect the disclosure of information. NDAs can be used between businesses or they can be used with an employee. Whenever you use NDAs, you have to make sure the person's initially briefed of their responsibilities, and then when the relationship's terminated, like they're leaving the company, you have to remind them of their responsibilities. Typically, this happens in an exit interview. Social media use has exploded over the last 10 years or so. Although some companies check social media as part of a background check, some employers continue to monitor their employees' activity. Of course, whatever the policy states, it can't violate the law, but realistically, you should be careful about what you post anyways. It's not uncommon for companies to use outside entities, which we refer to as third parties, for things like services or products that they need. This means that we need to have policies regarding those organizations. Supply chain refers to all the elements required to produce and sell products and services. For example, if we were building a car, then all the companies that we source parts from would be considered part of the supply chain. The supply chain can absolutely be an attack vector that we need to watch. Sometimes these other companies will have direct access into some parts of our applications or our network, and that means that we need to address limiting access in our supply chain policy. We might also mention vendor diversity, meaning that we need to use multiple vendors to protect ourselves if one vendor has issues. We also have to monitor end of life, or EOL, and end of service life, EOSL, to make sure that whatever products or services that we're getting from our vendors aren't going to stop being supported. Now, there's 3 common agreements that we can use with our vendors and that you need to know about. The first one is a service level agreement, or an SLA, which gives performance expectations for our vendors, like minimum downtime or required uptime. If SLAs are breached, there's usually some kind of compensation that occurs, like discounts or refunds. We have Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, which is sometimes also called Memorandum of Agreement, MOA, which states the intent of our companies to work together. Unlike SLAs, these don't have compensation penalties. And then we have Business Partner Agreements, or BPAs, which detail the relationship between business partners, including their obligation towards the partnership. These can help settle conflicts between partners if they arise. Also, when I say partners, this is usually referring to partner companies. Another term to know is term of agreement, and this is the period that our agreement is going to be in effect for. When it comes to protecting data, it's crucial that you have data policies that state how you handle data securely so that it doesn't get leaked either intentionally or unintentionally. In this section, we're going to talk about important concepts around data protection policies. Data classifications help ensure that users understand the value of data, and it helps to protect sensitive data. We can ultimately implement more or less security controls depending on the sensitivity of that data. A common data classification policy that governments use includes top secret, which if released to unauthorized individuals could cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. Secret, which if released to unauthorized individuals could cause serious damage to national security. Confidential, which if released to unauthorized individuals could cause damage to national security. And unclassified, which isn't really a classification, but it applies to everything else. Private companies will typically have a different set of classification levels, but the idea is the same. Some examples include public data, which is available to anybody, like on your website. Private data, this is information like personally identifiable information that needs to be kept protected. Confidential data, that needs to be kept limited to a certain amount of people, like salary information. Proprietary data can include patents, trade secrets, or any business-specific information. Financial information, this can include information about how companies spend or earn money. And customer data, this is anything collected and maintained about customers. An important distinction is that the government levels are a standard that has to be used in that environment. However, in private companies, they can use whatever they want. Personally identifiable information, or PII, is information that can identify an individual person. Health information is also considered PII, which includes information like full name, birthplace, social security number, medical information, and you get the idea. Typically, 2 or more pieces of information will constitute as PII because, for example, your full name alone isn't considered PII. This is also the type of information that leads to identity theft, so it's important that we protect it accordingly. Ultimately, the protection that we put into place goes back to the impact of the organization if that data were exposed to unauthorized individuals. The NIST Special Publication 800-122 is worth a read to learn more about protecting PII. Data governance is the process an organization uses to manage, process, and protect data. I've listed on the screen here some important regulations that impact how organizations govern data. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, or HIPAA, deals with how health information needs to be protected. Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, requires financial institutions to provide consumers with privacy notices explaining what information that they collect, and how it's used. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, or SOX, holds executives in organizations individually responsible for the accuracy of financial reports. And the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, which mandates certain protections of privacy data for individuals who live in the European Union. There's other regulations out there that could be relevant to you currently, or there might be future regulations after this recording that you need to be aware of. But the main takeaway is that you need to be aware of any regulations that apply to your organization. Let's talk about some privacy protection techniques that you can use. The first strategy with regards to privacy regulations is to store the minimal amount of data that has to be protected. The less there is to protect, the less chance for fines or penalties. Data masking is a technique that modifies data to hide the original content. For example, instead of storing a social security number in a database column, you might reference a customer ID, which is a uniquely generated number, and use that to track the customer throughout the rest of your databases. This prevents somebody's social security number in a lot of different places where that customer is referenced. Anonymization modifies data to protect the privacy of individuals by removing all PII within a dataset. For example, hospitals track all kinds of information on patients, like when they check in, what they're there for, and so on. All this information is linked back to a specific individual, but if we can remove the links to keep it anonymous, then we can avoid PII data storage issues. Pseudo-anonymization replaces PII and other data with pseudonyms or artificial identifiers. This happens when the actual identity of a person is replaced and can only be linked by a master table. For example, instead of listing John Good everywhere, we replace it with J5, which means nothing unless you have that master table. And tokenization replaces sensitive data elements with a token. This is commonly used with applications like Apple Pay on your phone, where the payment system never receives your actual credit card information. They only get that token. Data retention policies state how long data is to be retained and possibly where it's stored. These kinds of policies help us to only retain what's needed or required, and they also help to limit our liability from storing data for too long. Imagine if data protection regulations changed and we collected way too much information. We could be on the hook for all that information. Data sanitization is the process of properly removing data or destroying devices before we dispose of them. This even takes place before you repurpose a device internally. The idea is that there's some checklist or set of procedures that will remove the data completely, because standard deletion of files doesn't actually delete what's on devices if they retain memory. Devices that can retain memory range from computers, mobile devices, all the way to printers, scanners, and analyzers. Some common methods include file shredding, which involves repeatedly overwriting space with ones and zeros. Wiping completely removes the remnants of data on a disk. Erasing and overwriting with non-traditional tools. Destruction, since some devices like SSDs or solid-state drives are very difficult to wipe entirely, and this includes either completely demolishing a drive or incinerating it. And degaussing, which is very common with standard hard drives or tape drives, and it uses a very strong electronic magnet to make sure that data can't be read. Of course, there's many ways, but those are the most common. When it comes to keeping an organization secure, training users is extremely important because they're very frequently the weakest link. Ultimately, the better trained the users are, the less likely that they'll make decisions that put us at risk. Just like with learning anything, people learn in different ways, so it's important they use effective training strategies. Computer-based training, or CBT, provides users with a training course that they complete on the computer. Sometimes this is only accessible on the internal network, or we might allow users to train from their home or another location. Computer-based training is great because users can go at their own pace, they can rewatch things if they need to, and we can test their knowledge with quizzes. Phishing campaigns are useful because attackers frequently try to use phishing attacks to get access to our networks. These allow us to send attachments or links so we can see if users are easily tricked. Gamification combines a game design element with user training so that more people are going to participate. A lot of times you might see computer-based training include some kind of game aspect, but in general, you can even introduce a competition atmosphere between employees or departments for who does the best. And Capture the Flag, or CTF, is a gamification technique that we use a lot in cybersecurity training, but at its core, players are trying to follow cues that solve a challenge and result in finding a flag. Role-based awareness training is training that's specific based on somebody's job role. Since everybody has a different job, they'll face different types of risk, and it's important that we train them for that. Some of the common job roles include data owner, which ultimately owns data within the organization and has to make sure that data is classified correctly. The data controller determines why and how personal data should be processed. A data processor is any entity that uses and manipulates the data on behalf of the data controller. A data custodian, or data steward, is responsible for routine daily tasks such as backing up data, storage of data, and implementation of business rules. And a data protection officer is responsible for ensuring that the organization is complying with all relevant laws. Business continuity planning helps organizations predict and plan for potential outages of critical services and functions. ultimate goal is to make sure that critical business operations keep running throughout the outage. The Business Continuity Plan, or the BCP, is a plan that we need in businesses to provide the steps to return critical functions to operation after an outage. A BCP considers disasters like environmental issues like floods and person-made like human error that causes disaster. A BIA, or a Business Impact Analysis, helps to identify critical systems and components that are essential to an organization's purpose. Basically, these are the mission essential functions that the business needs to operate. If it's an e-commerce business, then the website is critical. If it's a hospital, then life support systems are crucial. If the mission essential functions can't be restored fast enough, then the business might actually not survive the disaster. The BIA only identifies core business or mission requirements and doesn't recommend solutions. Additionally, the BIA should address the maximum time that systems can be down and how much the company might lose in dollars. Site risk assessments focus on identifying risks for a specific location. It's also important to know that each site location might have different functions which serve as their mission essential functions. We know that the business impact analysis looks at different kinds of scenarios that can happen, but it also aims to identify the impact of these scenarios. Some key questions to consider include: will a disaster result in loss of life? Will property damage result? Can we reduce risk to personnel? Are there risks to the organization's reputation? These are all the things that can impact the organization, and they need to be answered. When it comes to recovery, there's 4 really important terms that you need to know. The first one is recovery time objective, or RTO, and that's the maximum amount of time that it can take a system to restore after an outage. Basically, the RTO is saying how long can the business accept a system to be down, and past that, there could be unacceptable damage. Recovery point objective, or RPO, is the point in time where data loss is acceptable. An example using RPO is if an organization was okay with losing data from yesterday's backups as long as we have all the data prior to that. Mean time before failure, or MTBF, measures a system's reliability represented in hours. For example, we might expect a hard drive to fail every 2,000 hours, so the MTBF is 2,000. And mean time to repair, or MTTR, is the average time that it takes to restore a failed system. Sometimes people also call this the mean time to recover, but it's the same thing. Let's say that same hard drive is going to take us 2 hours to repair, so the MTTR is 2. Sometimes the MTTR might be more or less, but it's an average. Continuity of operations planning, or COPE, or co-op, is focused on restoring mission essential functions at a recovery site after a critical outage. For example, if our main location is down completely for whatever reason and we need to spin up an alternate location. Site resiliency is the idea that we can use a recovery site or an alternate site to take over during a disaster. There's a few site options that we have to choose from. The first option is hot sites, and these are up and running 24 hours a day, 7 days per week, and they're basically an exact clone of our primary site. That means that we have all the equipment, software, and so on that we need. These types of sites might just be another office location that we already are using, but it takes anywhere from a few minutes up to an hour to transition over. Hot sites are by far the most expensive option because we need duplicates of everything and we have to maintain everything like normal. Cold sites require power and connectivity, but that's about it. If we needed to use a cold site, we would bring over all the equipment and software. These sites are the least expensive option, but they have the potential for the most to go wrong. A warm site is kind of in the middle of hot and cold sites by having the hardware that we need, but not the data. This means that we basically just need to copy over the data and we can start operating. There's a few other sites that we're gonna call other sites, but mobile sites are rarely used, but this could be like a semi-truck that's outfitted with what you need to operate. And then we can have a mirrored site, which is an exact copy of our primary site. So this is like an extreme hot site where everything is running and operational without a transition period if we need the site. When we're going back to normal, organizations need to return the least critical functions to that primary site first to make sure there's no issues. And then once we know that everything's fine, we can return critical functions back to the primary site. Disasters happen. It's just part of life, unfortunately, but the better that we're prepared and plan for them, the less impact that they're gonna have. Disaster recovery plans, or DRPs, identify how to recover critical systems and data after disaster. The disaster recovery plan contributes to the overall business continuity plan. You might see disaster recovery plans broken up into smaller plans for specific systems, or you might see an overall plan. The disaster recovery plan will also prioritize the systems in order of restoration, and it's important that this is done before something happens because you don't want Bob having to make a judgment call. Typically, you want critical functions restored first, then security services, then support services. A typical disaster recovery process looks like this. First, you activate the disaster recovery plan. Then you implement contingencies like alternate sites. Then you recover critical systems after the disaster's passed. Then we test recovered systems before they're brought online. And then we do an after-action report to review the disaster and document the lessons learned. Simply put, your business continuity plans and your disaster recovery plans are worthless if you don't test them. Some plans can be tested with a tabletop exercise, which is basically a discussion of the process. Some plans need to be tested with walkthroughs or simulations. The key is that you have to test and improve your plans. Don't let a disaster strike and then it's your first time going through the plan. That's a bad idea.